Since the dawn of social media, iPhones, and global access to data and Wi-Fi, our world has changed. We are now fully immersed in an age of information. However, the tools we use to inform us have transformed the entire psychological and social landscape of humanity. They have transformed how governments engage in warfare, amongst themselves, but more importantly, against their own people, against the people they are designed to serve. This video seeks to describe the methodologies of economic and psychological warfare in the modern world, the philosophies that underpin these methods, and the history of how we got here. There are three types of governments. The first is a government that does not deceive its people and protects its people. The second is a government that deceives its citizens in the interest of protecting them. And the third is a government that deceives its people in the interest of exploiting them. To understand what type of government you are ruled by, we need to first take a moment to analyze certain patterns of behavior, including our own. The people of a democracy are responsible for the actions of their government. However, our perceived agency as Americans to drive change at a political level has never been lower. Is that intentional? If it is, how can we tell? Let's look to the patterns of your government's behavior. Namely, how does your government share information with you? Do they provide a clear, coherent narrative? Or do they systematically share information that is designed to make you feel hopeless, powerless, but most of all confused? That defeatist response that you and everyone else you probably know experiences is a key feature of this new system of political and economic control.
The sharing of biased and false news has become all too common on social media. More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
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 We live in an age where information is abundant, so we assume that we are more informed than ever. But do any of us feel that way? Don't we just have more information, not necessarily better information? Who's to say? But what we do know is the volume of misinformation directly spawned by members of the federal government between 2020 and today is overwhelming, offensive, and no longer a matter of debate. We are run by a government that disproportionately benefits from taking from Americans rather than supporting Americans. There is actually a very clear reason for why this is, and why this point I'm making likely resonates with many of you. And in order to understand this reason, we need to study who has maintained power in our modern world the most consistently and effectively. Who is the master at managerial power? Who has maintained power the best in this modern world? Who identified this collective lack of belief in politics and political action that has now spread across the world? Well, it's Vladimir Putin. So what can we learn from Putin and his methods of political control? Well, we have to turn to one of his political advisors, named Vladimir Surkov, who actually came from an art and theater background, specifically avant-garde and modern art. Why does this matter? Well, Surkov took the lessons from these art forms and brought them right into the heart of politics, changing our world forever. So why modern art and the avant-garde? What did modern art illuminate to Surkov? It proved that we could redefine and undermine what people considered beautiful. This movement in the arts effectively proved that with enough academia, credibility, and authority, you could convince human beings to no longer believe their own eyes, to no longer believe what they believed was beautiful, because what was beautiful was now something to be determined by experts and the people in the know. Objective beauty and economic value became completely and grotesquely severed. Surkov's goal for Putin's Russia was not simply to manipulate the people of Russia this way. He intended to go far deeper. His goal was to undermine people's perception of the Western world, especially the institutions responsible for reporting truths, unleashing a socioeconomic environment where no one is ever really sure what is really happening. Under Surkov and Putin's Russia, they financially backed contradictory protests and political action groups. They backed everything and anything. Environmental groups, neo-Nazis, LGBTQ, anti-Putin, pro-Putin, anyone who needed to feel heard, they supported. They supported them by simulating and therefore stimulating democratic process. They understood that fundamentally, people wanted to feel heard more than they wanted their lives to change. But then Surkov told the world that this is what he was doing. The problem became even worse. From that point forward, no one really knew what was real or fake. The people of Russia simply became members of a theater of controlled opposition. A Russian journalist reflecting on this is quoted stating, "It is a strategy of power that keeps any opposition constantly confused. A ceaseless shapeshifting that is unstoppable because it is undefinable." And if you study sociopathy and psychopathy closely, that is exactly what those individuals seek to do, to maintain control over other people. They are shapeshifters. They seek to destabilize your perception, to make themselves indefinable to others. Because if you cannot define something, you cannot create a coherent narrative against it. And if you cannot create a coherent narrative against something, you lack sufficient power and positioning to strip their accumulating power away from them. Because they understand that perception is reality, and if they can control your perception, especially your perception of what is possible, they can turn you into whatever they want you to be. Today we live in a culture that no longer believes in change, let alone revolution, which means we live in a culture where even our leaders have no idea how to change the world. So much of the political and economic power in the Western world has been handed over to financial institutions and a black hole of bureaucracy. And we know our elected officials now serve their interests and not ours. Politics, not just in Russia, but arguably across the entire Western world, has become a strange theater of controlled oppositions where no one really knows what is real or fake. For the first time in history, our basic needs are now met with abundance. People want to feel heard more than they want their lives to change. And now today, the issues that remain available to democratic process have become so horrifyingly small relative to the problems at hand. Democratic process is now for entertainment purposes only. This is how Putin defeated journalism in Russia, because a journalist's central belief was that their job was to expose lies and to assert the truth. Putin and other Western leaders that followed made this process of truth-seeking totally irrelevant. Back in the 70s and 80s, young people in America had a wildly different view regarding what career path they considered motivating and appealing. One of those jobs was to be a journalist, because journalists were known as individuals willing to risk their lives in war zones or through confronting dark, powerful people to expose and illuminate important truths to the community. But today, that is no longer the case. Journalists are now seen as weak and even harmful to society, contributing to an ever-growing polarization. This exposes a more fundamental change that has occurred. We no longer believe in the truth. We believe in individual perception over a consensus reality. We live in a world that prioritizes self and our own individual experience above all things, especially above collective action or any actions directed at improving the quality of life for your community. Have you noticed? You no longer live in a community. Loneliness is now a global epidemic. The World Health Organization earlier this year declared loneliness a global public health concern, claiming chronic loneliness can be as bad for a person's health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. But I would argue this is by design. We are taught in school to pursue work alone, to pursue a career by ourselves. We are not taught how to work together with the people directly around us. When people ask you what you value or believe in today in any topic of conversation, you are offered a polite, whatever works for you. Our belief in a collective narrative, and even more importantly, a collective value system, no longer exists. We are psychologically occupied over our individual experience to a degree that would be very difficult for our ancestors to understand. We have a global culture that incites and isolates individual rumination. So how do these systems of political control, governed by a managerial class, manifest themselves in economic policy? We discuss psychological warfare, but now, how do we understand how this manifests in the form of economic warfare? Well, to understand this question through a new lens, we again have to look to Russia, specifically academics at the Russian Academy of Sciences and the Moscow School of Economics in the late 80s and early 90s, during President Mikhail Gorbachev's tenure. What happened at this time is covered in a book by an unbelievably underappreciated economist, James Galbraith, titled The End of Normal. He quotes the following statement made to Mikhail Gorbachev. "Mr. President, when Homer returns to write the history of our epic, he will say that the Russian mathematicians swept out of Muscovy in 1991 and presented themselves before the gates of Wall Street, bearing the gift of quantitative risk management models. They were received with joy, set to work, and in 20 years had destroyed the place entirely. It was he who will say, the greatest Trojan horse operation since Troy." What are they referring to when they mention quantitative risk management models? They are referring to quantitative easing, and he describes it as an innovation of Russian mathematicians, which it undeniably is, and they compared its deliverance to Wall Street and the American establishment as the greatest Trojan horse operation since Troy. We engaged in quantitative easing for the first time in 2008 and 2009, and we saw very clearly that it did not help the people it was supposed to. Over 90% of the liquidity created from quantitative easing in 2008 and 2009 went to the wealthiest 5% of global citizens. Factually speaking, is the largest transfer of wealth directly to the rich in all of documented history. This economic policy can be described as socialism for the rich. And as you all know, we just did this again following the COVID-19 pandemic. We printed more than what we printed in 2008 and 9, but this time an even greater percentage of it went to the wealthiest people in the world. So what does this all mean? What should we reflect on? Well, in my opinion, Christopher Nolan is famous for portraying many of these ideas, specifically exploring the ideas of perception manipulation, invisible meta-narratives, and power through his films like Inception, Tenet, and Memento. I would argue that his interest that leads him to make these movies and the fact that they resonate with audiences is because they touch on the strange mood of our time, where nothing really makes any coherent sense. We live in a circus of contradictory stories that makes it impossible for any real opposition to emerge with its own coherent narrative. Because, like we discussed earlier, it is impossible to define what the opposition really is and what their goals are. Their only goal is to maintain power through simulating and stimulating the experience of economic growth and democratic participation. And if we study history, we know that when the powerful are not competently challenged, they are invisible to the people they rule. But when they are competently challenged, they are extremely clear to see and begin to very publicly and dramatically flex their power. Today, I would argue, the most powerful people among us remain invisible. They are not on Twitter. For a moment, consider the use of the word they. Some of the smartest and most influential people in the world today, subconsciously or unconsciously, continue to use the word they when discussing the powers that be. Listen to any podcast. Everyone uses the word they, knowing it points to nothing tangible. But even more strangely, very few people challenge its use, because what it is pointing towards seems to be something undeniably real.